So, uh, I got to tell one of those stories that's heart is full of landmines, but I think it gets us started in the right direction. Growing up, maybe start this way. You know how there's food culture? Like you get married and all of a sudden you're like, you eat what? And you don't like this and you do like this? And have you ever heard of salt? And like, why do you eat so much salt? And what is a crock pot? And how do you eat anything? If you had that experience, maybe married, maybe you got a roommate, maybe, I don't know, you went to another part of the world. So there's this food thing that happens. Well, so of course, growing up, and my mom's a great cook, and she was really good about, we ate family meals, I think, most days, as I recall, and that was a great thing. And then my parents divorced, and in high school, my dad remarried, and in high school, I lived with him and my stepmom, and her name was Mary, and she had little tiny kids. And in hindsight, like I can appreciate things now as a 41-year-old man that I couldn't appreciate then. Like then I was just like, where's the food? But then now I'm like, man, she was a working mom and a single mom. And so her way of preparing meals, hi Mary, if you're watching, it's great to see you, but her ways of preparing meals was different. And at the time, frankly, at the time it was wrong, and now I would just go, it was just different. And mostly what she did was, or at least what I remember, I'm sure it wasn't the only thing I do, but in my head, every meal was a crock pot meal like that. And again, it makes sense to me now. Like you're going to work, your kids are going to school or whatever, you come home and now you've got a roast and carrots and potatoes and all these things. But for a guy like me who likes dry, salty food, it doesn't work very well. So there's that context. And then the other bit of context is since moving here from Billings, you miss the restaurants. And maybe you have a place when you go back to where you went to college or where you grew up or whatever. And especially in Helena, frankly, we have a few really good restaurants, but the key word there is a few. And so I don't know about you, but when I go on vacation, like part of what vacation entails is eating good food at good restaurants. And there's this, I think, culture divide. Like my dad, he'll go to Mexico for a week, and his first day there, he'll go to the grocery store and buy $5 worth of food, and that's all the money he spends on food the whole vacation. And I'm like, what are you on vacation for? It's to eat the food. So there's these disconnects. So when we would go back home, when we do go back home, but especially early on before we kind of figured all this out, I'm like, I don't want to eat at home. Thank you very much. Let's go to Guadalajara. Let's go to CJ's. Let's go to all these places that I miss going to. So a handful of years ago, back to the beginning, must have been a week or two before Christmas, and we always head back to Billings for at least a few days after Christmas. And one thing that I think my mom taught me, and Mary does, we all have in common, is she's also a planner, Mary is. And so she shot my wife a text saying, hey, so thinking about food over Christmas and planning for the menu, what are you guys thinking? What do you want? And I think it was a Sunday night, my feet were up, I was relaxed, I don't know, but I said to my wife, kind of like I thought between us, I said, tell her to leave the crock pot in the cupboard. And my wife, who doesn't understand sarcasm and only shoots straight, which is what makes her a remarkable person, unbeknownst to me, not knowing I was joking, she just grabbed her phone and said, Adam said, leave your crock pot in the cupboard. So it led to a conversation. But what I respect is the planning piece. And here's what I want to get at a little bit this morning, and I hope this is true all the time. I think it's especially true this morning. It's not important to me that we agree on the conclusions, but I do think, and I'm not assuming everyone here is a God follower, but I'm assuming that if you're in this room, you either used to be or you might be, you're thinking about it or you are, like that there's good reasons not to be here, so that you're here, I'm assuming you're engaged. And the question that I want to pose this morning, that again, it's not important to me that you agree within your own personhood or your own family culture or even your own business that we agree, but I think it's a conversation that we have to be intentional about, and it's this question of what's the relationship between waiting and planning? And how do we find healthy balance between those two things? Because I think we can all agree that we're in this season of waiting. And the staff, I'm so proud of them. They've worked so hard to make themselves available for lunches and walks and all those things constantly. And one thing that seems we all agree on is we're in this season of waiting. That the business world we live in, the education world we live in, the family world we live in, like everything about our world it's like in this in-between time. That this isn't what we're waiting for. And there's not necessarily agreement. Nobody knows, are we waiting for a month or 4 months or a year or 2 years? We don't necessarily know how long we'll be waiting. But we're all clear that the life we're living is different than the one we will be, and it's much different than the one we were. And so we just got to figure out how to wait. And I can respect that. But where I want to push a little bit is to ask this question, and to what degree, to what extent, if any, does health mean also planning? I'm thinking about Christmas. I'm thinking about Halloween. I'm thinking about next weekend. I've tried to even catch myself in my vocabulary. There's this thing, and I've been saying it more than anybody, of like, yeah, they're going back to school. That'll last a week. And I guess my question is, to what extent is that helpful? Like, what if, and I guess this is just my biased bottom line, what if what's healthy right now is to acknowledge that we're going to wait, to plan all the same, and then to know that we're probably going to have to like cancel our plans and replan 1,000 times between now and Christmas Eve? And what if that's not the easy thing, but what if it is the healthy thing? Like, waiting is one thing, and I think we've been talking about this since March 16th, that I don't know about you, but my confidence in the text and the trust that I have, Scott McKnight said this well, I heard this week, this teacher and theologian, he said, the amount of trust I have for people who are sincerely trying to follow Jesus is just going up. And the respect I have for the text in the way that it captures God and people living lives that it turns out aren't that much different than our own is just going up. And on this theme of waiting and planning, I think it's central to the story. In fact, in Isaiah 40, there's this section of Isaiah 40 to 55, and I've known for a while, like, this is this paramount passage of Scripture as it relates to understanding Jesus and the way he understood who he was and who God was. And so I've been studying it pretty extensively the last 6 weeks, took a class from it, doing this stuff to get ready for Christmas. I think we're going to do a series called Plan C or something like that in December. But in the first chapter of that, it's the quintessential waiting passage. But I think it's also the quintessential planning passage, and I'll try to make my case there in just a minute. So let's just start into 27, and where this verse gets to, where this passage, I mean, it gets to this, like you've all seen it on your aunt's wall. Like, it's a very familiar passage in the end, but let's build towards it a little bit. It says, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by God?" See, this is the high school student going, if there's a God, he wouldn't ruin the football season. This is the parent grieving, like, how am I supposed to celebrate the birth of a new baby? This is us going, hey, God, where are you? It's Carl's story, I think, captured that very well. And what's going on here is this is in the moments when God is going to lead these people out of exile. We call this Isaiah. It couldn't possibly be Isaiah. It's a follower of Isaiah because the original Isaiah lived way before this, but this is the season of, like, God going, hey, I'm here, and I'm about to prove to you that I'm here. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Now, here's the cultural context. Excuse me. In the ancient Near East, gods were like football teams or sports teams of any kind. Like, the way your God proved to be more powerful than their God, and remember, we're not talking large continents of countries, we're talking little city-states in many cases. The way your God proved that your God was more powerful than the other God was that your army beat their army. Which means that when Jerusalem fell, when the temple was destroyed, that wasn't just a political travesty for the Jewish people. That was a profound theological problem, because that would say in their world that the Babylonian god Marduk was stronger and greater than the Hebrew God, Yahweh. If you have any exposure to Judeo-Christianity, you kind of take for granted, this God is the creator of the earth. He's the creator. He's not a local deity, he's the cosmic creator. But this is what's getting worked out for these people. Is God even real? And God is showing up and going, I am the cosmic creator of everything. Part of when you ask the question, what did Israel learn in their exile? What did they learn in waiting? What they learned was how to work out that God was king when circumstances said otherwise. I think Gay captured this very well in the Q&A. I don't remember what service last year, but when she said more or less that waiting is a function of the kingship of God. That part of what we do in this season of waiting, and I hope this has become part of your emotional and spiritual rhythm, is you wake up right now and as you think about your business or your kids or your school or whatever, there is this relinquishing. Because you're a great businesswoman and you got the thing to where it is, and suddenly you're aware there is so much outside of your control. It's the invitation of surrender, of relinquishment, of God, you're the king, and I'm trusting that you're leading to this good place. This is what Israel learned. He gives power to the faint, and strengthens the powerless. See, we take that for granted, but remember, even humility was not a virtue in Jesus' world. It was a weakness. Even youth will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted, but those, and here's your grandmother's verse, but those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. See, these people, and I guess this is the question, what if they discovered a way of life that was all about waiting? It was all about relinquishing. It was all about surrendering. It was all about trusting that God is king. But here's where my bias is. I'm going to say it's not just a season of waiting, and here's where I get this from. So we know, you may know, that Cyrus, king of Persia, not long after all of this, and part of what happens in Isaiah 40 to 55 is God is saying, I know this is going to blow your minds, but Cyrus, this foreign king that he would call this pagan king, he's actually my king, he's actually my leader, and I'm going to use Cyrus to send you back to Jerusalem, like he's going to do my work. That's that whole like God can speak through a donkey if that's what he has to do kind of principle. And Cyrus does do that. He defeats Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was dead by the time Cyrus came on the scene, but his empire crumbled. He sends the Jews back to Jerusalem. Eventually, they get to rebuild the temple. But the caveat was God still has to be your king. Or Cyrus still has to be your king. And part of the way they survived all this was to say, okay, well, we can do that because God, not David, is our king anyway. But here's how that worked out practically. For many people, not all people, for a contingent of people, they retained their identity as exiles. You can go read the prophet Zechariah. You see this in there. There's this retention of this idea of though we're back in Jerusalem, though the temple's still there, we are still exiles. Why? Because we're still under a foreign king. And by Jesus' day, we see all kinds of expressions around this idea. You see some people who go, we're not waiting for anything. Herod's king. The most extreme example would be the Sadducees. They went all into, we're done waiting, we're just in the planning phase, God is back, to the extent that they even cared. And at the other extreme, you've got the Essenes. We think the Dead Sea Scrolls came from an Essene sect. They're these people who did the opposite. They wouldn't even associate with the temple because they didn't think the temple was even God's place, and they were all in on waiting. But there's this middle people that went, wait a minute. Ezekiel said way before the temple was destroyed that God left in a chariot before it was ever destroyed. So God wasn't defeated by Marduk. God left. And they believed God had not yet returned. This is what sets the stage for Jesus, but this also is what sets the stage for many of these people in the Jesus story who are in this kind of waiting but planning phase. I think of it like this. Real estate is crazy right now, and I think we all know that, and I frankly have a lot of empathy for those of you looking for homes. And I was thinking this week about when Teresa and I bought our first house, which you suddenly feel old when you go, yeah, back in 2003 when we bought our first house, we were fresh college grads. She was pregnant with our first. We were looking for houses, not knowing what we were doing. I just took some advice from some people, went to the bank, got pre-approved for a loan, and I still remember sitting in the loan officer's office, and this is kind of funny when you think about the crash that happened, and going like, you pre-approved us for how much? Like, there's no way I could afford that much house. And there was this whole conversation about what percentage of your income that you want to go to your mortgage, and I think Ramsey's thing is 25%, and so we were trying to stay close to that. And so I don't even remember how we got connected with this realtor, and I have great respect for many of you who are great realtors, and like any industry, there's people who aren't so good at it, and I think we got one of those not so good ones, quite frankly, because in hindsight, she kind of fished out of us like, what were you approved for? And we told her, but then we were like, yeah, but this is where we want to spend, not here. And the first house she showed us was like, I think it was $10,000 more than we were approved for. And I remember it was so frustrating because we liked it and we wanted it, and then there was this like, but we can't afford it. What are we doing here? And so then we started looking at houses. I think we just like canned her, and I don't remember entirely how that all went, but we started looking at houses that we kind of thought we could afford, but frankly, we didn't like them, and maybe some of you can relate to this. We were looking at this stuff like, I think we could afford this, but I don't even want this house. I don't like this house, and it's not in the neighborhood we want. It's not the style we want, blah, blah, blah. And there was this point, I remember there was this house, because there was a neighborhood we wanted to be in, and it was like 4 blocks outside that neighborhood, and we kind of didn't like the house, but it was the closest thing we'd seen yet, like a month in. And I remember Teresa and I kind of disagreed because I'm like, we got to just settle for this. It's not going to get any better. And she's like, I don't want to settle for that. And there was a friend in my life who was like, Adam, don't tell God what he can't do. And maybe that sounds odd to you, but and I've used this principle a few times in my life. He was just like, I've used it with vehicles too. He was just like, Adam, like, take a breath, slow down, keep looking, but trust that it'll align and things will happen. And frankly, we went through the same experience in Helena and same deal. You're looking at stuff going, I don't even like this, and I don't even, blah, blah, blah. And then in both cases, there was just this moment where just everything came together. And maybe that's offensive because it hasn't for you yet, but what I've taken from that, and there's a cliche around it, like you pray like everything's up to God and you work like everything's up to you. And when I look back on that, what stands out to me is that we weren't just sitting on our couch waiting for a house. We were doing the work, and many of you know it's exhausting work, looking after house after house after house, and it took longer than we thought. And in my mind, God provided. And I wonder if that principle that probably all of you go, oh yeah, I agree with that, if that doesn't apply to this season. Because what I want to suggest is that's what these people did, especially these both and in-between people. Dr. Dellermarter, I remember him saying in grad school, in the text, the hyper-conservative don't survive, and the hyper-progressive don't survive. It's these people who are constantly kind of trying to live in this third way. I don't want to be political. It's not my intention. It's not important to me that we agree on to what degree you socialize or where you do your schooling for your kids. But what if there's this precedent of people waiting and planning? Like, I think of Jesus' mom, Mary, and one of my favorite questions in the Bible is, why Mary? Like, why did God use Mary? And I think part of what I like is the Bible doesn't directly answer the question, but it gives us these little tidbits about her character, that she was this young girl, probably 12 or 13 years old, who was engaged to be married, and God shows up and is like, hey, I'm going to do this pregnancy thing, and it's going to be crazy, and you're going to be called all kinds of names, and your son, nobody's going to believe you, and you get to go tell your fiance, like, hey, I got good news and bad news, and he's going to say, what's the good news? And you're going to say, I'm pregnant, and he's going to say, what's the bad news? And you're going to say, it's not his, and he's going to go like, I think you're missing news somewhere in here because neither one of those really work out that well. But Mary, in the end, she goes, okay, sign me up. And then she runs to her cousin Elizabeth's house. And I think Elizabeth was her spiritual confidant. She was that person that she seemed to call when life was most disturbing or most exciting. And there's something about what she says to Elizabeth that I'm going to argue portrays her as this woman who both waited and planned. We call it Mary's Magnificat, and here's how it starts. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. See, that Savior word it cues us in. There was a bunch of Jewish people who they weren't waiting for a Savior anymore. They thought that they had it. And then there was a bunch who weren't at all engaged. They were living in the middle of nowhere. They couldn't have been in Galilee. And then there's Mary, who she recognizes that she's waiting, and yet she's living. For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. And watch this generation language. I think this is important. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one who has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him. This is that, like, God, I don't know what the future looks like, but I'm trusting you're in it. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. Listen to this. To whatever extent the way I'm describing Mary is accurate, stop and get your brain around this. She's 500 years into this disposition. Like, she's a part of this long heritage of people who deep in their guts are waking up every morning and going, the world is not what it's supposed to be right now. God is going to come back and put things back to rights, and I'm not there yet. And she's not living in a hole in the desert. She's living. She's identifying with this tension. He has shown strength with his arm. That's Isaiah 40 language. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. This is the story of a God who comes alongside the weak, which is opposite of their culture. He's filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever. I think it's probably anecdotal evidence, but I guess what I want to suggest is what if What if perusing the Gospels would demonstrate that Jesus seemed to come alongside people who did both, who lived in the tension of the waiting and the planning? And to the extent that it's true, I think it begs this question. And this is, again, my motive isn't to be right this morning, but it is to kick it back to you and get you thinking about within your business, within your family, within your own emotional life, what is it going to look like for you to wait in this season? I'm not suggesting we should throw caution to the wind or throw our masks in the garbage or any of that stuff. How are you going to understand what a healthy waiting looks like? And to what extent are you going to wake up in the morning and go, God, you're king, this is your world. I'm trusting that even though it doesn't make sense to me, it makes sense to you. And I'm relinquishing my plans on what my senior year was supposed to look like. And to what extent are you going to plan? How is that going to look? Another way to ask it is, what's your 20-mile march? Like, we've had these little adages over the years, the daily leads to the dream and 20-mile march and your rule of 5. Frankly, I just had a meeting this week with someone who was just suffering. And what was clear as I was talking to this successful business person who you'd never know when you saw this person on the street, the degree to which they're suffering was just this realization, like, dude, your routine, it's obliterated. Your 20-mile march is gone. Your rule of 5 is gone. You know, there's this iconic story that, for me, I think is important now as it was when we first discovered it 6 or 7 years ago, about 2 explorers in what was the summer in the southern hemisphere in October of 1911, as they were getting ready, each of them independently, to be the first people in the modern world to make it to the South Pole. One expedition crew was going to be led by a guy named Robert Falcon Scott, the other by a guy named Roald Amundsen. And when you listen to their personalities or study their personalities, Jim Collins in Great by Choice, the reason why that's a top 5 book for me all time, has a lot to do with this story. They're 2 very different people. The equipment that they brought, one of them brought 5 thermometers, one brought 1 of them brought mechanized sleds, the other one just brought dogs. I mean, they're very, very different people. But one of the real nuances of their differences is how they went about getting to the South Pole. Because racing to the South Pole was half of the adventure. The other adventure was getting the heck out of there before winter set in and you and your people died. So they both knew the distance, and they both did their calculations. And Robert Falcon Scott decided that to put it bluntly, he was going to make hay while the sun was shining, so to speak. So on days that were nice and the weather conditions were good, they'd cover 40 miles. They'd just go for it. And to the degree to which they had those kind of days, they would push themselves as hard and as far as they possibly could. And then when it turned and it was bad, if they had 1 day or 3 day or 5 days worth of weather, they just didn't leave their tents. They just hunkered down and recovered and slept. Roald Amundsen had the exact opposite approach. He had done the math, and he had decided that if they were going to do this successfully, they were going to march 20 miles every day, rain or shine, 10 below or 40 below. And there were days where his crew were angry with him because it was such an ideal day, and they were quitting at 20 miles, and that seemed insane, but they quit. And there were days where it seemed imprudent to leave their tents, and they did 20 miles. And when Robert Falcon Scott got to the South Pole, with his bursts of energy, he got there and he had the discouraging experience of seeing his competitor's flag already planted in the South Pole. What he didn't know was it had been planted there 34 days before him. The 20-mile march guy, he got there first, and frankly, he got out alive. And Robert Falcon Scott couldn't say the same. I think another way to frame all of this is to go, what if it's time to breathe? Grieve the part of your 20-mile march that has to be changed, but decide deeply what's the plan, and how do we blend waiting and planning, and what if waiting and doing nothing are fundamentally different things? You know, from a church standpoint, our intention is not changed. I'm so proud of the staff. We're going to gather and scatter. That's been our 20-mile march, and that's not changing. And yet, you saw when you walked up, like, I'm so proud of Hannah and the hospitality team, and the sense of, like, wait a minute, suddenly the lack of a lobby here at the Grand Street's getting exposed, and there's nothing they can do about that, but let's create space where people actually can connect and have conversation. And Tommy and the band and what they're doing with music, and this recognition that some of the songs that are really big, they don't play as well in a room that's half full. And so working on hymns and familiarity and stuff that you all know. Lexi and Narrate Kids, she's had I don't know how many meetings with parents to just go, like, what's working? working, what's not working, and part of where I'm excited about what she's doing is turning it back, what I'm going to call to more of a youth group model of less large group production stuff and more relationship with teachers and kind of a youth group feel to the thing and playing games. Gay in the nursery, part of the reason I wanted her up here last weekend was that you would just get a sense of the gold that she is, the care that she's going to give young parents and babies. And additionally, the remarkable spiritual director that she is someone that you can meet with. Justin with the tech, I mean, it's astounding some of the stuff he's led us through. And Marla did a great job of setting the table, and Justin's just picked it up. One of his ideas is he's working on developing some on-site hosts, which means that we'll have weekly volunteers that don't even live in Helena, but people who will just like show up and go like, hey, I'll be saying hello to people who are doing the online thing, and I'll be telling them, here's the Slido thing. Doris and the work that she's done around the budget, I mean, can you imagine what that's been like for her? And she's not panicked. She's like, we got this. We're doing great. In fact, we had an idea this week that I was like, and we'll spend from the reserves. And the council's like, we'll spend from the reserves. And Doris was like, nah, we can figure it out. I'm like, someday you're going to let us spend from the reserves, right? So we can stand on the stage and say like, hey, we spent from the reserves. My point is this, and then we're going to scatter. We're going to do Dunk and Dine, which is a religious experience, not an event, because we can do religious experiences, not events, and so that's what we'll do. Halloween, we've had conversations around that, and maybe we do Friday night gatherings and then scatter on Saturday on Halloween, and maybe we organize some hiking and biking stuff Sunday. We don't know, because we don't know what Halloween holds. And Christmas Eve, we're doing it. We'll do it responsibly, and we don't know if it'll be here or the Civic Center or the fairgrounds yet, and here's the catch, and we'll probably set plans and rework them 10 times. And that's okay. And that's exhausting. I mean, that played out this week. My brain has been scrambled because what I thought we were going to talk about this morning was that starting on the 13th, we're going to start gathering at the fairgrounds. Temporarily, pay rent here, but the idea was if we could create more space for more people to feel more safe and give you all a lobby and say to the community, hey, if you're broken and you're looking for a place to check out, like you can come be in this warehouse that's designed for 10,000 people and there'll be 40 of us there. And I'm just convinced that the amount of pain in our community is much more than we know. I saw a stat this week that said 25% of males ages 20 to 30 had considered suicide at least once in the last 30 days. It's there. If you're not hearing it, we are. And so we're like, and I'm not even sure if it's the right decision, but we were going for it. We got approval at 10 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. Yep, you can meet at the fairgrounds. And then 2 hours later, that was more or less taken away, and that conversation's happening again with county health and some of those things. But my point is simply this. What if in your life, in your family life, and frankly in your church life, what if it's time to breathe and develop a habit of waiting and get back into planning? Get back into just acknowledging, yep, and then it's going to get canceled, and that's okay. You'll figure it out again. And the extent to which you want to be a part of that with us around here on Sundays, those cards, this is traditionally Calling All Owners Weekend, and we almost didn't do them because, frankly, if you're in the room right now, the odds are very high that you are serving, and we get that it's complicated. What I'll tell you is we lost 75% of our volunteers with COVID. And that's okay, the team is scaling, but to the degree to which you decide that you want to make doing this together as part of your planning, we would love to do that with you. So as you pray this week and as you process as an individual and a family and a household, take that card with you, and if you decide you want to build serving on teams with us into your routine, we would love to make that happen for you. I'd like to pray. God, Lord, I know that we can self-justify heroic behavior really easily, but it does strike me that the business leaders in this room and the parents in this room and the students in this room and the athletes in this room, quite frankly, it feels like the easiest thing possible is just to phone it all in, to protect ourselves emotionally, to plan for nothing, to assume the worst about October and November and December, and thus to protect ourselves from that disappointment. And yet, God, we recognize that we're a part of this long faith tradition of people, in some cases, who spent 500 years in this waiting, planning tension. And so, God, to some extent, this would be about us and our lives, our families. But to some extent, it would be about our community and asking these questions around what does it look like to serve people and make plans for serving people, knowing full well that we don't know the future and we can't control it and we may have to grieve our plans and come up with them 6 more times, but someone's got to do that. God, I pray for people whose just simple rhythms like their nutrition and the gym that are just obliterated right now, and their substance use is through the roof, that your Spirit would come alongside this week and give people the courage and the supportive relationship necessary to come up with a plan. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.